All of our stories tonight, in one way or another, are about survival, of people, of ideas, of hope. We begin with Anne-Marie Berger's story about a group of people whose connections are so strong they can never be broken. They go back a long way, for some, as long as they can remember.
1920? Which?
1929.
1929, there we go. Okay.
In November, a group of alumni from various graduating years got together for a reunion at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Des Peres. And while they did attend the same school, this was more of a family reunion than a class reunion.
Corky and I were in charge of feeding the hogs. So one day...
These men and women grew up in the Lutheran Orphans Home in the building where Des Peres City Hall now stands. They were raised together like siblings.
That's all I knew. I mean, it was home. It was from little on. That's all I knew. My mom and dad were separated. It was right during the Depression, and our mother couldn't take care of us. So through a Lutheran family in Washington, Missouri, they made contact with the Lutheran Orphans Home in Des Peres, and we were brought out here.
Rosie Davis Kaiser was a year and a week old when she and her 4 older siblings arrived at the orphans' home, and why they ended up here is similar to many of those who grew up right along with them. Kids were dropped off because parents died, jobs were lost, or there were too many mouths to feed, and often it was a combination of all the above. But whatever their circumstances were, the Lutheran Orphans Home would be their new home, and these young kids learned to accept it.
Scary, but it wasn't really scary. You just didn't know you were in a strange place, all new faces, everybody, you didn't know anyone. And when we first went to the home, they put you in quarantine. They did that to all the children, put them in quarantine, make sure they were healthy and wasn't carrying anything.
Kids don't grow up in orphanages anymore. The foster care system has replaced those kinds of residential facilities. But 140 years ago, there was no established system to support kids who had lost their parents and families. And this particular home, the Lutheran Orphans Home, began because of a request from a dying Civil War soldier.
The Lutheran pastor shows up. He's a man by the name of Johann Binger. And Binger ministers to this dying soldier, and he asks him one fatal question. You know, after he's prayed with him and done everything else, he says, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" And the dying Civil War soldier says, "Well, I'm glad you asked. There is. I have a 10-year-old son. I don't have anyone to care for him. Will you take him in?"
Binger took the little boy in, and before he knew it, more orphans were being left in his care. According to their historical records, which are written in German, as word spread throughout the Lutheran community about these orphaned kids, people began sending in money to help Binger support them, and the Lutheran Orphans Home was born. Binger purchased 40 acres of property on the northeast corner of what is now Ballas and Manchester Roads for $4,000. The first residence was a log cabin, and by 1893, a new residence was built to accommodate more than 100 children. In 1935, that building caught fire. All 114 kids made it out unharmed, but the residence was destroyed. That's Rosie on the front page of the paper. Again, donations poured in, and a year later, the orphans had a new fire-resistance residence to call home. The children ranged from infants to teens. Some were adopted, but most of them remained at the home until young adulthood.
It's Karen. You remember Karen? Yeah. She was.
Yeah. No wonder she was so...
Rosie Kaiser and Sid Purdy lived at the orphans' home until they graduated high school, and their memories are like those of any childhood friends looking back at their youth.
There's Hero.
No, she's a good girl.
I was a brat.
But Rosie and I was a kitchen boy, And you know, you had a lot of canned goods. You know, all the tomatoes, the apples, everything came out of jars. So it was my job, after all the jars were washed, to take them down and wrap them. And I'd go down to the tater room. And that's where we kept the taters. And Rosie would come down and she'd help me roll these jars in paper, you know, and pack them in these barrels so that you would have them to send out the next time you, I guess, people would pick those up.
So they were clean?
Yeah. And then, but Rosie would help me in the tater room. And one day I gave her a kiss for helping me. You know. So, that was a no-no, huh?
The story is out.
To them, life at the orphanage was normal. They went to school, had chores, and parental guidance from the staff. Visiting day was Sunday, and Sid and his two brothers saw their mother as often as she could make it. But Sundays were never easy, whether a child had family visit or not.
My mother would come out to visit us, and that was great. But then when she wanted to go home or leave us, why, you know, it was kind of sad for us. But
and Sunday was hard sometimes.
Yeah, what was that like for you without having a family visit?
Some days was very hard, and other times I just found something to keep me busy.
And there was plenty to occupy her time. While these kids didn't go without, they had a home, clothes, food, and education. They were responsible for the cleaning, cooking, ironing, and farm work.
we had a hay field for hay for the cows. There was probably 6 or 7 milk cows that we had. We had 1 Holstein cow and 6 Guernseys, and the garden was perfect.
We always had responsibilities, things we had to do, things we had to, and as we got older, the responsibilities got bigger. We worked hard. We worked very hard. And I don't regret that because I learned some good work ethics, and I'm grateful for that.
The Lutheran Church and its members supported kids at the orphanage until the late 1960s, when the orphanage closed its doors and took on a new form. In 1973, the orphanage, its buildings and property were sold to the city of Des Peres, and the money from the sale has helped develop and sustain Lutheran Family and Children Services, an organization continuing the mission of Johann Binger.
We always need to be asking, what are we doing for kids? What are we doing for kids in this day and age that they can have the opportunities and everything that comes along that we've had in our lives?
Today, Lutheran Family and Children's Services offers counseling, pregnancy and adoption services, foster care, and child development to families of any religious denomination. And 140 years later, St. Louisans are still benefiting from Binger's promise.
I think most people probably feel like an orphan, that poor kid out there where they're beating him to death and all that kind of stuff. But we were really privileged compared to maybe other children out in the community because we got to do a lot of things. There was thousands of people who cared about us. We didn't know it at the time.
And it was not all peaches and cream, but we had a lot of fun, a lot of good times with a lot of good people. And we had a lot of people that cared.